Hello there and welcome to my tutorial to paint the good side of the Marvel Crisis Protocol Earth Mightiest Heroes core set. As you can see, I sprayed up Winter Soldier and Black Widow black, and the rest I sprayed up with a matte white. First thing I'm going to do is paint the metallics on Black Widow as she's kneeing a Ultron drone right in the mush. I used Iron Hands steel to fill in all the bits that were going to be metal. I also did the same for the Winter Soldier's metal arm. I then used a mix of Basil Canum Grey and Contrast Medium to cover all the metallic parts we have just painted. While that dries, I started on Captain America and Captain Marvel by using some craggy blue all over the areas that are going to be blue. As I'm painting onto white, it will take a couple of layers to get a nice smooth coat. I then used Drakenhof Nightshade on Captain America. I used that without diluting any of it, so it's a little bit sharper. With Captain Marvel, I diluted it with some Lamium Medium. I wanted a different blue on Spider-Man, as this is the fourth Spider-Man I've actually painted now, so I've used Thousand Suns blue on all the areas that will be blue. And that was given a wash of Contrast Medium, a Kellen Green mix. Next I went back to the Ultron drone and I used some Iron Hand steel to give the drone a nice dry brush just to help pick out those details. I did the same to the Winter Soldier's arm as well, and after I highlighted with that, I gave it another dry brush with some Storm Host Silver. I then tidied up Black Widow's outfit and made sure that the spray had got everywhere using some Abandoned Black. And then I used Corvus Black to start highlighting areas on the body. I did the same to Winter Soldier, however I only stuck to his flak jacket. I then mixed a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey to do another secondary highlight, followed by Eshin Grey just by itself to do the final highlight. I then used Eshin Grey to paint the Winter Soldier's trousers, and then I gave that a wash with some Nuln Oil mixed with Lamia Medium. While that dried, I moved on to Captain America and Captain Marvel and used my craggy blue to tidy up the areas that we had previously washed. I then mixed in some Calgar blue, about 25%, to add the first highlight, picking out all the muscle details as I went. I then added more Calgar blue to brighten up the mix a little bit, so we've got basically a 75% Calgar blue mix at this point. I then used Calgar blue to highlight the muscles even further, until finally adding a tiny amount of white just to make it ever so bright to do the very edges of the muscle structure. I then used Thousand Suns blue to neaten up all the areas on Spider-Man, adding some Armor and Blue for a 50-50 mix. Then it was just Armor and Blue by itself, followed by a 50-50 mix of Temple Guard Blue and Armor and Blue. Now at this point I'm really just trying to pick out the muscle details rather than anything else. Then it was Temple Guard Blue just by itself. And for that final highlight I added a tiny bit of Blue Horror to the Temple Guard Blue, just for the very sharpest of points. With all the blues out of the way, I then went ahead and used some matte white to tidy up all the areas that I'm about to paint red. The reason for this is because I'm going to be using some Flesh Terror Red contrast paints on all of the miniatures that have red on them except Iron Man. I'm using a contrast paint here because it's a nice way of getting all that shading in as well as the bulk of the main colour. I want my Iron Man to stand out from the others a little bit, so I'm going to use the Blood Angels Red contrast paint. While all this contrast paint dries, I went back to the Winter Soldier. First thing I did was use some Eshin Grey just to start picking out those details. And that was followed up by mixing in some Mechanica Standard Grey so I can do those final parts of the edge highlighting. I then used that same mix to paint the Winter Soldier's gloves and his mask. And then gave them all a wash with some Nuln Oil. While that dried, I used some Evil Sunz Scarlet to start highlighting Captain Marvel, Captain America, and the segmented sections of Spider-Man. With Spider-Man, take your time, go slowly, and try your best not to make any mistakes, because the segments are really small and he can get quite fiddly. After that, I did a 50-50 mix with some Wild Rider Red just to start picking out those edge highlights. This again was for Captain Marvel, Captain America, and Spider-Man. Lastly, it was just Wild Rider Red on its own to do the very, very tips and finer points of the edge highlighting. It's really just used for sort of knuckles and very, very sharp edges. Again, for Spider-Man, this is the part where you really have to be your most careful and definitely your most neatest, so try and make sure you've got a nice sharp point on the end of your brush. With their red finished, I'm going to move on to Iron Man. I'm going to basically be pretty much doing the same thing, so it's going to be Evil Sunz Scarlet just to start the main highlight, followed by the 50-50 mix that we used previously with Wild Rider Red. And then finally, Wild Rider Red just by itself. I then added some matte white to the Wild Rider Red to do a very final edge highlight. I then used some matte white in some corners and other various areas just to make it look like the armor is actually shiny. After that, I then made a glaze with Blood Angels Red and gave all the red armor a once over. While that glaze dried, I finished off Winter Soldier's gloves with some Mechanical Standard Grey highlight to begin with, and then mixed in a very small amount of Dawnstone just to do the finer points. I then used Dryad Bark to paint in various details such as belt buckles and pouches and the holsters on Bucky, alongside Captain America as well. I also did Captain America's shield handles. That was then given a once over with a coat of Nuln Oil. I then did a second glaze, not completely going over everywhere, on Iron Man just to make the shadows a little bit darker. And once that had dried, I then did another glaze with some Flesh Tearers Red just on the shadow points. I then used Black Templar contrast paint to go over all the areas where Venom is on the Spider-Man base. While that first coat dries, we'll start putting the gold on to Captain Marvel with some Retributor armor. And we'll do the same with Iron Man as well as Black Widow. Black Widow's gold will get a wash with Agrax Earthshade, while Captain Marvel and Iron Man will get a coat of Reichland Fleshshade. While that coat dries, we'll give a second coat of Black Templar contrast paint to the Venom parts of the Spider-Man. And then we'll use some Dryad bark to start painting the layers onto Winter Soldier and Captain America. At this stage, I also forgot to do the holster for Black Widow, so I quickly got that up to speed as well. We'll mix the smallest amount of Baneblade Brown into the Dryad bark just to add the first edge highlight. And then we'll add a little bit more, so it's more of a 70-30 mix with Baneblade just to do the final edge. This version of Captain America has some grey on his uniform, so we'll mark that in with some Eshin grey. And we'll paint the back of Captain America's shield with some Iron Hands steel. Both of these areas will then get a wash with some Nuln Oil. For Black Widows and Winter Soldiers, weapons will give them a coat of Black Templar. And while that dries, we'll move back to the gold. We'll use some Retributor armor mixed with a little bit of Liberator gold for the first highlight, followed by Liberator gold on its own for the second. With the bulk of everything got out of the way, we're now going to move on to the finer details. So I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint the spider on Spider-Man's chest and his eyes. I'll use some Iron Hand steel on the ports of where the repulsor beams are for Iron Man, along with his chest. I'll then use Corvus Black on Black Widow's weapon to give that a highlight. And I'll apply some Corvus Black on to the Venom parts of the Spider-Man as well. I'll also quickly highlight the center spider chest and his eyes as well. I'll then use some Eshin Grey as a dry brush very carefully to highlight the Winter Soldier's weapon. Now it's finally time to move on to the skin, so I'll start with a base coat of Bugman's Glow on everyone who's got exposed skin. And that'll be given a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. While that dries, I'm going to highlight the grey on Captain America with another coat of Eshin Grey. And then with a very subtle highlight of Mechanica Standard Grey. I'll then start blocking in the white details on any character who has them with some grey sear. It's mostly Captain America and Spider-Man's web, alongside Spider-Man's and Venom's eyes as well. All the white received a wash of Basil Keenum grey mixed with some contrast medium as well. After that, I started working on the eyes. I did a black line across, followed by a white line. I also painted Venom's and Spider-Man's eyes at this stage as well. And then I added the pupil to all the characters where you can actually see the pupils. With the eyes now out of the way, I carried on with the skin. It was a mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone to begin with, followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just on its own. Finally, I added a 50-50 mix of Kislev Flesh and Cadian Flesh Tone just for that final highlight. I then painted the Winter Soldier's knife with some Iron Hand steel, and that was followed by a highlight of Stormhost Silver. The Winter Soldier's red arm was painted with Mephiston Red, followed by Evil Sun's Scarlet. I then used Corvus Black on Captain Marvel's shoes, and followed that up with a wash of Nuln Oil. Going back to the Winter Soldier, I painted his hair with Catachan Flesh. Captain Marvel's was painted with Zendari Dust. And Black Widow's was painted with Gal Vorbak Red. The Winter Soldier then received a wash of Agrax Earthshade all over his hair, where Captain Marvel received a soft tone wash on her hair, as did Black Widow. To finish off Iron Man, I used some armor in blue dotted in the repulsor beam and his chest, as well as his eyes, followed by a tiny dot of white in the center. Captain America was then finished off by using matte white to paint all the areas that we'd previously painted grey sear. along with Spider-Man's web. All that's left to do on Spider-Man is finish off Venom, so we're going to use some Screamer Pink on his gums. And then we use some Pink Horror to mix in and give the gums and the tongue a highlight. His teeth were painted with Zandari dust, which was then highlighted with a mix of Zandari dust and Ushabti bone, followed by Ushabti bone just by itself. Finally, to finish off the painting, I then painted the areas that would be lit up on the Ultron drone with some Fugan orange, which was highlighted with some Fire Dragon Bright. Now it's time for those bases, so we'll start with Captain Marvel and we'll do a little bit of Dawn yellow around the edge of her foot where the blast is. And the same for Iron Man, but this time at the bottom of the blast. Then I'm going to use some Fire Gits yellow around the edge, basically broadening out that light, the lighter area. The whole idea of this is to basically be light on the inside and get darker as we go. To throw in a little bit of depth, we're going to use some Cassandora yellow wash just around the areas we've just painted. And then doing a little bit of a wet blend, we're going to use some Fire Dragon Bright on the tips and the outer edges. That'll be followed up by some Troll Slayer orange. And then finally, on the very, very, very tips, some Wild Rider red. We'll let that dry for a bit and we'll start to work on the silver by using some Iron Hand steel on any areas that you wish to be silver. And then I'm going to use some Corvus Black to do the sort of blast effect, the smoky effect on the bottom of Iron Man and around the very tips and edges, even in the middle layer as well. Keeping with Iron Man, we're going to use some Armor in Blue to represent that blast of power coming out of his jet boot, which will be highlighted with some Temple Guard Blue, followed by a little bit of Baroth Blue added to the mix. And for the final highlight, we'll just use some Baroth Blue mixed with a tiny bit of white for that extra little bit of colour. Next up, we'll use some Dawnstone Grey to paint all of the concrete and any of the rubble, which will be lightly edge highlighted with some grey sear around the edges of the base and all those little concrete slabs and any cracks as well. With most of the painting out of the way, we can finally tidy up these bases with some Abaddon Black. And then some Agrax Earthshade, watered down slightly, and then blended in all over the base to give it its final look. And there we are, that's the good side now finished for the Marvel Crisis Protocol Earth's Mightiest Hero core set, along with the bad guys. I really hope you enjoyed, and this actual guide helped you all the way through. It didn't take too long, roughly about 10 hours to paint all of them. I'm very happy with the way they come out. Again, Atomic Mass really do some absolutely phenomenal and outstanding miniatures, and these guys are definitely an upgrade from their previous core box set. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye for now.